Simple gun shooting. To keep the video short, I have already created a test scene. It contains a simple plane object, a blue cube which represents the player, and has a rigid body and a movement script attached to it. The red cube represents the enemy, which has a tag named enemy applied, and a health controller with a user interface I will cover in another video. Let's select the pistol object and add a script called weapon. First we delete the start and update method, since we are not going to need them. Then we add a float variable we use to determine the weapon's damage. We will also need a variable we can use to determine the weapon's fire rate, and another we can use to determine the weapon's fire distance. We will also need to add a variable we can use to reference the pistol's bullet point. Another we can use to determine if the gun is currently able to shoot in a given moment. And the last variable we can use to get information about the object we hit when executing a Raycast. Then we create a void method called fire with a string argument called enemy tag. Inside the method we add an if statement, checking if the fire cooldown is true, and call return to stop the method if that is the case. Then we create a ray object where we set the origin to the bullet point's position and the direction forward from the bullet point, which we transform from local to world space. After creating the ray object, we add an if statement where we execute a raycast inside, using the ray object, the hit variable, and the fire distance. Then we add an if statement inside, where we check if the raycast hit a collider with a tag equal to the enemy tag. And if that is the case, we get the health controller component from the hit collider. And we then call the health controller's applied damage method using the weapon's damage. To ensure we are able to see the raycast within Unity's scene window in play mode, we use a method called drawRay on the debug class by giving it a start position, direction, and color. We also need to set the fire cooldown equal to true to avoid it being executed every time it's called. Instead, we add a method of type enumerator where we can tell the program to wait a number of seconds before executing the rest of the code within the method. To do that, we write yield return new wait for seconds with the fire rate as a parameter, and we then set the fire cooldown to false. To execute the enumerator, we use a method called start coroutine. We also add a third method of type bool called useTab, with program to return true if the fire rate is equal to 0. We are almost ready. Let's open Unity again and write a script to control the weapon. Before creating the weapon controller, we need to add the bullet point object to the weapon script. And we also change the weapon's distance and the weapon's damage. Now select the play object and create a script called weapon controller. First let us delete the start method, since we are not going to need it. Then add a variable of type weapon we will use to reference the player's weapon. And another variable of type string we will use to determine what objects the player can damage. And we also need a third variable of type bool we can use to determine if the script should call the weapon's fire method. Then we add an if statement inside Unity's update method where we check if the left mouse button was pressed. We also add an if statement below it where we check if the left mouse button was released after being pressed. and then we check if the fire variable is equal to true, and if that is the case, we call the fire method on the weapon with the enemy tag as a parameter. After calling the fire method, we add another if statement to check if the weapon used tap, and if that is the case, we set the fire variable to false. Now let's open Unity again, and add the enemy tag, and the weapon to the controller script. We are now ready to test the weapon. Press play, and if you look in front of the pistol on the left window, you see a small green line every time we press the fire button. If we move the player a little bit and shoot the enemy, we can see the health starting to drop. And if we select a weapon, we can easily change the damage. We can also change the fire rate if we want the weapon to be an automatic weapon instead. And the fire distance, if we want the weapon to have a longer distance.